In our last lecture, we characterized Kierkegaard as a marginalized saint. That is to say, a human being operating primarily within the saintly tradition, following the saintly pathway in his individual search for meaning. But a saint who was so thrown off course, so much struggling against the turbulence in the saintly tradition, caused by both adaptations within that tradition as a result of the shifts within the cultural milieu that we traced around the period of the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, and at the same time trying to recover some of the resources of the heroic tradition to hold his ground, keep his place within that turbulent atmosphere. In that sense, Kierkegaard's individual, highly ironic experience serves as a kind of index, a marker for the fact that in the course of following this evolutionary history of the paradigms of saint and hero in Western culture, we've come to the brink, the edge of an abyss, if you will, but at the very least to a tipping point where the balance begins to shift, the experiment of conversion comes decisively to a halt, and a new dynamic replaces it. In this lecture, we want to identify a kind of unifying thread connecting Marx, Darwin, and Freud, three radical cultural innovators in the second half of the 19th century. That connecting thread, as we will see, emerges when we recognize that each one represents a decisively different view of history than the view of history previously dominant in Western culture, and that the view of history which each one shares with the others fundamentally changes the dynamic of cultural evolution. Together with Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and others, Marx, Darwin, and Freud contribute to a prevailing climate of suspicion regarding human nature. Suspicion and uneasiness regarding the nature of human culture. Even nature itself. The Kierkegaardian experience of dread and anxiety generalizes itself into the strongly felt suspicion that more is at work in the dynamics of historical cultural development than anyone has recognized or that anyone can be entirely comfortable with. This climate of suspicion sets in motion a process of mutation, cultural adaptation, from which will emerge new images, as we'll see in future lectures, new images of the hero and the saint and the worldviews which they inhabit. Let's begin with Marx. The works of Karl Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels offer a new interpretation of human identity and a new characterization of the human search for meaning as being fundamentally economic in character. In the Communist Manifesto, which appeared in 1848, Marx draws on his earlier work to present a radically different understanding of history than Hegel's earlier interpretation. Marx, like Kierkegaard, can broadly be characterized as being in powerful reaction against Hegelianism. As we have already briefly discussed, Hegel viewed history and the dialectical unfolding of what he termed absolute spirit, the inner logic of history itself. Through progressively more and more complete and rationally adequate enactments of self-awareness, until it comprehends itself, this absolute spirit, as being the truth of reality as a whole, a truth which, as we've seen, Hegel regards as being wholly rational. Now, Marx described himself as undertaking a project to stand Hegel on his head, turn him upside down, by converting Hegel's dialectical history of spirit into the methodology which Marx called historical materialism. The basic premise of Marx's historical materialism was that human identity derives from its capacity for labor, that is, the capacity to transform nature in productive ways. Marx also introduces the concept of alienation to characterize the effect on human labor of capitalism, and particularly capitalism accelerated by the Industrial Revolution, its effect of distorting the relationship between laborers and the means of production. For Marx, this distorted relation is furthered by ideology, which for him means the ideas behind social institutions and patterns of class relationship which privilege the interests of one class above other classes. Alienation from the human identity, the state of being human, which labor provides, results not just in economic loss for those so alienated, but in a spiritual loss as well, a loss of meaning. Thus, we have to understand Marx's historical materialism as a genuine theory, not just of economics, but a theory of meaning as well. A theory of meaning that encompasses human existence as a whole. Labor denotes for Marx the exercise of the human creative imagination in relation to material nature, producing not merely commodities, but values. Values which open up another dimension of human history, open up its future. This is Marx's ideal of social progress, the creation of humanity's future, a progress toward a classless society of material creators. Thus, we can understand Marx's condemnation of religion, famously put in his phrase, the opium of the people. Marx is not simply reacting against religion. He's not merely making an atheistic assertion. He's characterizing the inadequacy, as he sees it, of an entire way of being human, of an entire way of searching for meaning, the saintly way, the religious way. He's attacking it in defense of human social and material identity from the alienating impact of ideology in every form, including religious ideology, behind which he discerns essentially the dynamics of class struggle and power confrontation. Let me quote to you from Marx's introduction to a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy, where he says the following: religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So when we put Marx's famous dictum, religion is the opium of the people, into its context, we see that it reveals itself as having a much more complex significance for him than simply a rejection of traditional religion. It expresses human existence alienated from itself, in conflict with itself, and specifically with the reality of its experience of suffering, which is the essence of the human economic condition. That is to say, the essence of the human condition as a whole, because the human condition is fundamentally economic. It is the condition of suffering the scarcity of resources, suffering the reality that there is not enough to go around. Not just materially, not just not sufficient commodities or money to go around, not sufficient meaning to go around. This also brings into focus Marx's contribution to the worldview from which the figure of the hero emerges. Marx reinterprets that Greek sense of the overarching force of necessity with which the hero, as we have seen, always struggles, the heroic agon. Marx reinterprets that in terms of the proletariat's struggle to overcome alienation from the forces of production. Religion is an opiate because it masks the true causes and true intensity of human suffering by invoking things like the will of God, substituting the consolation of future reward for the more appropriate reactions of protest, class struggle, and revolution. Marx's thoroughgoing reinterpretation of the human search for meaning in economic terms is paralleled by the work of Charles Darwin, who reinterprets history and human experience in terms of its biological and material character. The work of Darwin, particularly on the origin of species by means of natural selection, which first appeared in 1859, offers a powerful alternative conception of human meaning and identity based on biological rather than economic forces. At its core, Darwin's theory of natural selection is a theory about the meaning of history, not simply about the principles of biology, even evolutionary biology. Unlike the monotheistic conception of divine creation, or either the Aristotelian or Newtonian conception of nature as governed by unchanging physical laws, for Darwin, natural history is a dynamic process of constant interaction between diverse species of life and their changing environments. The only thing that is fixed for Darwin is the process of change itself, and the process of change understood in evolutionary, adaptive, and selective terms. Natural selection for Darwin is the process whereby hereditary traits best suited to prevailing environmental conditions are passed on successfully from those individuals who are more likely to survive and reproduce precisely because of those characteristics and hereditary traits. Self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. Regarding human identity and the search for meaning, Darwin's theory of biological evolution had several important consequences. First, it fundamentally challenged the teleological view of human history. That is to say, no longer could reality be understood only by assuming that it was intelligently designed as being directed toward a purpose, a goal, a finality which gave meaning to all of the intermediate steps along the way. This teleological conception was replaced by the evolutionary conception, which Darwin offered as an alternative. In that conception, as we've already said, traits which at the biological level are operative at the level of cellular function, but which at the level of culture are operating as meaning and value structures. These traits survive because they are well suited for survival in certain specific environmental circumstances. At the biological level, those circumstances are physical, climate, habitat, and all the factors that affect those. At the cultural level, we have to understand society and civilization as the environment, the habitat in which human beings must pass on those hereditary traits which are going to best equip those who follow them to successfully find and sustain meaning. These traits, in both cases, then, have a function, not a purpose. And life as a whole cannot be said to have any purpose except its own survival. So, in Darwin's evolutionary explanation of biological life, we're presented with a historical understanding of the human search for meaning. As it lacks a purposeful intelligence that gives history a larger meaning, Darwin's view conflicts with a creationist view within the scriptural tradition, not only on the level of empirical evidence, but also in terms of the worldview which it presupposes. The impersonal Darwinian universe is subject to the necessity of adaptation to the physical environment and is governed by the law of the survival of the fittest. While it might not be possible to portray the heroic in purely evolutionary terms, insofar as evolutionary theory, strictly speaking, paves the way for a genetic explanation of not only biological but also cultural patterns of adaptation, it nonetheless points toward a coherent theory of meaning as a genuine possibility in a worldview not based on purposeful intelligence. You see here, of course, the beginnings and the basis for the methodology, or at least part of the metaphoric methodology we've adopted in this course. As we will see as we progress, the attractiveness of that methodology as an alternative to a more teleological style of explanation will be reinforced over and over again by historical and cultural developments and by those who articulate them most pointedly. For example, Nietzsche will provide the first fully developed example articulated within the contemporary cultural context of such a worldview that has self-consciously made the shift away from the Judeo-Christian Islamic personalism that had characterized society as a whole for close to 2,000 years, to a worldview which overtly proposes the impersonalist vision of reality as an alternative. So it's within this context, then, that, for example, today, the ongoing creationist evolutionary debate makes clear This conflict is not primarily over the truth of two competing explanations of reality, but rather between two fundamentally different ways of interpreting reality. Two ways which are not based on facts primarily, but rather determine which facts count as evidence and how that evidence is to be interpreted. It's not a matter, in other words, of true or false, accurate or inaccurate, but rather which among two entirely plausible and feasible interpretations will function most successfully in promoting human thriving, whether biological or cultural. Our third example. The work of Sigmund Freud provides yet another instance of the pattern we've been tracing in this lecture, a pattern of radical alternative theories of history, perspectives on the interpretation of history, all three of which challenge the image of human nature as purposefully determined and purposefully directed. The pattern has now become clear that as we identify each of these concomitant or contemporary worldviews, the Marxian, the Darwinian, and now the Freudian, we're identifying them as being fundamentally Greek and heroic in character, rather than saintly. Marx was a Greek. Darwin was a Greek. Freud is a Greek, in the sense that the dominant worldview and the interpretation of history that they put forward rests on the assumption of the context of history being essentially impersonal and ruled by necessity. And that changes the way in which human beings can, or we could even say should, most appropriately should, go about searching for meaning in that world. Freud, as we know, developed a wide-ranging, complex, and frankly, at times, internally conflicted explanatory system for human behavior, which was simultaneously theoretical and practical. Psychoanalysis, in other words. Among Freud's most original contributions were his theories of the unconscious mind, including the defense mechanism of repression to protect consciousness against the anarchy of the unconscious. His identification of sexual or libidinal desire as the primary motive force in behavior, as opposed to rationality and the calculus according to rational means of cause and effect, motive and action. And finally, he contributed his interpretation or development of the practice of psychoanalytic theory itself as a therapeutic technique which specifically and directly supported the attempt for human beings to hold their own in terms of meaning and in terms of satisfaction within the turbulence of these impersonal forces that were at war in the human psyche. Building on the idea of the psyche as an expression of biological forces and the tension produced within consciousness by the interaction of bodily organs, Freud elaborated a whole worldview and a therapeutic technique that owes as much to Greek mythology and tragedy as to contemporary science. Freud, in his later works, presents a view of human identity based on the image of the tragic hero. Here, Freud goes well beyond anything that could be directly supported by scientific findings into the creation of his own mythology and a highly eclectic mythology at that, but based fundamentally on the image of the Greek hero. The hero who struggles against necessity, and especially the necessity of death, to fulfill his destiny, his Moira. For Freud, the role of the tragic hero was played by the psychic element he termed the ego, which struggled against the instinctual drives of the id, which were repressed into unconsciousness as a result of civilization's patriarchal authority operating in the form of the superego, the necessity to restrain the pleasure principle, to limit gratification for the sake of homeostasis, maintenance of the organism as a whole. In Freud's interpretation, the fate of the ego must, in the end, enact the very same drama of the conflict between the life drive, Freud referred to it in its Greek term, eros, and the death drive, thanatos, which unmask pleasure not as a goal, but as a way of recognizing and taking into account the untenable situation of the ego. For Freud, the ego is literally the tragic hero. Pleasure for that tragic hero, when it can be obtained, is physical, yes, but the physical interpreted as giving a meaning or an identity to that struggle. For Freud, the human search for meaning culminates in the acceptance of the tragic beauty of the human condition. Taken together, we've been gradually trying to establish in this lecture a basis for saying something like this: Marx, Darwin, and Freud represent a multi-pronged reassertion of the heroic worldview and the identity of the hero, which draws energy, evidence, and meaning from the evolutionary cultural developments which the Enlightenment culture of individualism, capitalism, and empirical method helped to set in motion. So successfully that as that movement accumulated momentum, its inertial force brought about a kind of seismic shift at the level of culture. A seismic shift ultimately so significant, so profound, and, as we will see, so traumatic that it really did require not only the attempt to redress the balance between the saintly and the heroic, but an expression of a fundamental suspicion that there was something so deeply incomplete, so deeply flawed, if you will, at least in terms of the dynamics of human cultural evolution, in terms of the deep reality, the deep patterns of the human cultural genome, that either an entirely new version of the alternative to that saintly paradigm, a new version of the heroic, had to be elaborated, or something that in some profound way, genuinely profound but unimaginable at this point in history, and perhaps still today unimaginable, something genuinely, profoundly new must take its place. In our next lecture, we'll turn to Nietzsche to help us reflect on what the nature of that alternative might be and what the process of its realization might look like.